Okay. Thanks, Lee. Hi everyone. Welcome to the Colloquium. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ravi, who I've known for a very long time, since your undergraduate project about ketamine, says that. And Ravi is currently an associate professor at UCL, right, where you have been for a very long time.
Yeah.
Has done some work on ketamine and reconsolidation and changing maladaptive memories, and now is engaged in an enormous imaging study of DMT. I don't know what you're talking about today, Ravi.
A bit of all that.
It'll be very fun. So, as we've already kerfuffled around for a long time with this, I'll hand over to Ravi.
Thank you.
That's terrible.
That was great. Hi everyone, it's lovely to meet you. Thanks for the invite, Celia. It's really nice to come down and have some of your time. So, just to give you an overview of what you're in for, in case you look at this and think, I'm going to get out of here before this starts. I wouldn't judge anyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ketamine, other psychedelics, and nitrous oxide, which we've done some work with. Largely focused on applications in mental health, particularly addiction and post-traumatic stress disorder. And thinking a little bit about how these drugs, this kind of not new, but new interest in psychedelic drugs, understanding some of the mechanisms behind them, about how they might work to improve people's mental health, with a focus on targeting memories, which is something that a lot of my research focuses on. And then at the end, just talking a little bit about a new project that we've got starting, that Celia mentioned, with DMT. So before we get started, if you've got a smartphone device or if you're on a laptop, just a little bit of audience participation. Should let you scan that. Okay, so there. Everyone access it that wants to. Slightly exposing first question. So we're not getting I'm aware that you can't actually see the responses here. I'm just trying to get this over on the other screen. I can see them, so it's good for me. It's just sharing on here, yeah.
Oh no, you go back to
Here we go. If I
to
just
do that PC main. Oh no, do that.
It's just your presence sorted it out. It's nice to know that we've got a nice representative audience. It's fantastic. So we're in good company, and I'm hoping that therefore that means that again, responses to this one will be slightly different to what you might get from a normative population. But we'll see. You can put in, I think you can have as many goes at putting in words as you want as well. So if you've got more than 3 you want to enter, or however many it gives you, then go ahead. Still evolving a bit, but slowed down. I like the way that work's come up a couple of times. I assume that's because people are working with drugs rather than just taking drugs at work. But yeah, I've got an amazing mix of stuff there, which is really interesting to see actually, and pretty positive, I would say. Nothing really negative about that. There's very little, no. I've given this to a group of educational psychologists who I teach, and the tone is definitely far more negative, and largely focused around kids medicated with ADHD being medicated with amphetamines. But yeah, Wonk's in there at number 2. A fun Wonk fight. That's what we're all here for. Yeah, that is fantastic to see. Let me just walk back up. There we go. So, hopefully, I don't have to do too much diplomacy with talking about kind of drugs image change. But I think ketamine's a particularly interesting one, because if you'd asked anyone sort of in the late 90s or early 2000s about ketamine, their association would definitely have been with kind of the party scene and horse, crystal, people taking it just recreationally. But it's this kind of change of fate, which now it's kind of the diamond in the rough in psychiatric drugs. And a few years ago, we had Spravato, which is nasal esketamine licensed in the States for the treatment of depression. I'm a fan of comical nominative determinism, and so you might find it slightly unusual that the man largely responsible for overseeing this change of fate is John Crystal with a K. No conspiracy theorists, just saying. However, beyond all this, ketamine has also had a long history in anaesthesia and field medicine, particularly because it's not a respiratory suppressant like opioids. So it has actually for quite a long time been on WHO's lists of essential medicines. And so I just skimmed this data out of the Web of Science in terms of psychiatric publications on ketamine. And you'll see since the 1970s, we didn't have much, but then in the early 2000s, we had this huge increase in interest. It doesn't seem to show a sign of slowing apart from in 2021, but that's because of COVID, presumably. And this is largely driven by the fact that it's been shown to have these antidepressant effects, but now people are also looking at its utility in other disorders as well. So post-traumatic stress disorder, other anxiety disorders, and also addictive disorders, which is kind of spearheaded by a Russian scientist called Evgeny Krupitsky, who was looking at ketamine quite a long time ago before it was even really fashionable. So why are people so interested all of a sudden? Well, depression is a huge sort of global mental health issue. It's the most prevalent and one of the most globally disabling mental health issues there is. And we have some effective treatments, so things like CBT, psychological therapies, and SSRIs. But for about half of the people who have those treatments, they're not effective in the long term. And those treatments haven't really, particularly the drug treatments, they haven't really changed at all in sort of 60 or 70 years. So all these SSRIs, you have slightly different formulations of them. People call them Me Too drugs because they're all basically a variation on a theme. But there's not been any sort of big change in the drugs that are available for treating depression in a long time. Equally, SSRIs tend to take a couple of weeks to start working. And if people are suicidal in that time, that can be too long for people. and people want sort of more immediate relief from depressive symptoms. And ketamine seems to be kind of one of the answers to all of these problems because it works very quickly. And we've got quite a lot of data showing now that it works. So on the left here, we've got response and remission rates. And this is from a big meta-analysis last year. And we see that about 45% of people have a response, so a large reduction in their depression symptoms after taking ketamine. About 30% of people go into full remission. But on the right here, this is kind of all the individual study data that's contributing to those overall estimates on the left. And you can see how all over the place they are in this forest plot. So there's a lot of variability in the findings with ketamine. So it's, you know, it's not the case that it works for everyone either. And there's still a lot of kind of understanding that needs to happen about why it works for some people and why it doesn't for others. People have now started looking in post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is a crossover study by Adriana Feder and her group. So everyone in this study got either ketamine or midazolam, which is a benzodiazepine, and just in a randomized order. So everyone got both. But after the ketamine, in the blue bars, we can see people showed this big reduction in their traumatic symptoms, but not so much after the midazolam in the brown bars. And this was replicated 2 years ago in a smaller RCT as well, showing similar effects. So these are kind of PTSD symptoms on the y-axis here. You can see again a big reduction after ketamine, but not the control drug, which was midazolam. Equally in social anxiety disorder, so agoraphobia and other kind of related anxieties, we see this rapid reduction in anxiety symptoms. That's what's on the y-axis here, compared to placebo. And to note, these are the effects of the placebo and the ketamine on a questionnaire that measures dissociation. So what you see with ketamine, as you'll probably be aware, is that when you take it acutely, people get very dissociated. You don't get that with placebo. And I mention that because, you know, ketamine does have strong subjective effects, and that's something I'll come back to in a second that's potentially important in why it works. So this is Celia's study, the CARE trial, showing that ketamine is effective in alcohol use disorder. And what was really nice about this study is that it was combined with a psychotherapy in a factorial design. So people had either just the drug, just the psychotherapy, the combination of both, or neither. And what you can see is that combined with the psychotherapy, that's the orange bar at the top here. Yeah, I mean, you should probably be talking about this. We see the greatest treatment response. So this is the number of days abstinent people are from alcohol. What percentage of days abstinent, sorry. People who, you know, had just a placebo condition and without the psychotherapy did the worst. And this interaction wasn't significant, I don't think, right? But it wasn't sort of powered to look at that. But you've got another massive study starting now, right? Oh yeah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, watch this space, but that looks very promising. And equally with cocaine use disorder, so this is from a group in the States, Elias Dacquo's group. Combined with mindfulness-based therapy, in the green here, you see a much greater treatment response. So how long people are being abstinent from cocaine, and these are cocaine-dependent individuals. Much better responses are when the therapy is combined with ketamine and with placebo. This study wasn't designed like Celia's study to look at the synergy between psychotherapy and ketamine. And it would be nice to see more studies like that, because I think that part of the reason that ketamine might work is by amplifying the effects of psychotherapy. And this is something that we've definitely seen in the new interest in psychedelics more generally. So very much like ketamine, the classical psychedelics have seen a massive surge in interest in the last sort of 10, 15 years as therapeutic drugs. And these tend to be serotonergic drugs, so they bind to serotonin receptors in the brain. But what they share in common is that they produce these kind of profound changes in sensory experience, thought patterns. They produce euphoria and hallucinations and out-of-body experiences. So I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these examples. I don't need to spell out what they are to you. But it's kind of unprecedented to see such a huge increase in the interest in them, and particularly in the financial interest that's accompanied trying to develop them as therapeutic drugs. And a few years ago, psilocybin was received breakthrough therapy status by the FDA, which is the first time a psychedelic drug has ever received that status. So these are the results of a recent trial. This is an industry-funded trial by Compass Pathways. And what you see is that they gave people 3 doses of psilocybin, a very low dose. So psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. The very low dose, 1 milligram, was supposed to be a control, like a placebo. And that's the grey bar here. So you see far lower reduction in depressive symptoms than versus a medium dose, or what they expected to be effective, which was the high dose in the blue bar here. So that's 25 milligrams of psilocybin. I mean, what is notable here, and what you see in a lot of these studies, is this big drop-off in all groups, right? And these are people who had treatment-resistant depression. But when you come into people come into a study, despite being treatment-resistant, we actually see quite a big drop-off in their depressive scores, regardless of which group they're in. And this is the kind of pattern that you'll be able to see in a lot of these graphs that I show you. And it seems like being in trials where you expect good things to happen is itself quite good therapy. You can see a similar thing here. This is now looking at psilocybin for alcohol use disorder. So again, we see a big reduction in the blue line here. That's the psilocybin group. In the grey is a placebo. It's not just an inactive placebo, it's diphenhydramine to try and sort of mimic some of the flushing type symptoms you get. But we don't see as big a reduction in drinking. But again, we do see a drop-off. Obviously, people are in this trial because they're interested in reducing their drinking. So I think that's something important to take into consideration when we're hearing about all these impressive results of psychedelic studies, is that the trials themselves are quite potent places to change your behaviour. And if you look, this is not the COVID cases curve. This is publications on psychedelics from the Web of Science. It's absolutely going mental. Hundreds of publications over the last few years, and this has been accompanied by interest in changing legislation as well, particularly in the US, in Oregon in particular. But last week, or the week before, there was a parliamentary debate on the changing in the legal regulation of psilocybin as a treatment in the UK, led by Crispin Blunt, who has got an excellent name for drugs reform. This is from an older debate, actually, where the guy that was against the motion was Kit Malthouse. Clearly prefers a single malt to a blunt or a bit of psilocybin. So it's interesting to contrast the ketamine work and like the serotonergic psychedelics work, because within the classical psychedelics, people are very focused more on the whole experience, the setting and people's mindset going into it, and their intentions and the context in which the trip happens. Whereas a lot of the ketamine and depression studies have really not focused on that. It's been a lot more sort of monotherapeutic. And the assumption there is that ketamine just at some kind of biological level has an antidepressant effect. And I think potentially missing a lot of the benefits that can be had if we only look at that level of explanation. And people debate whether ketamine is or isn't a psychedelic. Certainly, if you look at some of the reports of people who've had the high dose ketamine in Celia's study, and also what we found in one of the studies we've done on ketamine, the things that people report, it's very much psychedelic-like experiences. So the question is, do those subjective effects, do they matter? And the answer is probably. So here's another ketamine study where they wanted to see whether being conscious when you receive ketamine was important for the antidepressant effect. So this is just a preprint, which means it's not peer-reviewed yet, but it's a very new study. They gave people ketamine under general anesthesia, people who had depression, and they didn't see any different effect to placebo in terms of depressive symptoms. So it's either that the other anesthetics block the effect, or that there's something about the conscious experience of having the ketamine that is important in reducing your depressive symptoms. But again, look at the drop-off in the placebo group. It's just something that you see so consistently, and that I think we shouldn't underestimate how strong the placebo effect itself can be. Which brings me on to ketamine's unloved little sister, nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide has had an image change over its history, but kind of in the wrong way. It's a very old drug. It was discovered by Joseph Priestley in 1772 and was much loved by Humphrey Davy, who was the founder of the Royal Institute. Here's an incredible illustration of a nitrous oxide party that doesn't look particularly consensual to me. But it's now on sort of every Labour ward in the country as an on-demand analgesic painkiller. And more recently, in our group and in just really one other group, we're looking at its psychotherapeutic potential. But if you guys think you've experimented with drugs, you've got nothing on Humphrey Davy. So he was synthesizing his own nitrous oxide from ammonia salts in various ways. And you can, his book, his research is in nitrous oxide is available online, and it is an incredible read. Some of his descriptions are absolutely incredible. So he says how I lost all connection with external things. Trains of vivid, visible images rapidly passed through my mind and were connected with words in such a manner as to produce perceptions perfectly novel. I existed in a world of newly connected and newly modified ideas. I theorized, sorry, the long S is getting me. I imagined that I made discoveries. And when I awakened from this semi-delirious trance, so Dr. Kinglake was the guy, his assistant in all of this research, took the bag from my mouth. Indignation and pride were the first feelings produced by the sight of the persons about me. And then he shortly after exclaimed to Dr. Kinglake, "Nothing exists but thoughts. The universe is composed of impressions, ideas, pleasures and pains." He nearly killed himself a couple of times because this is a diagram of a inhalation machine that he'd made, but otherwise he was just doing it from a balloon, and he forgot that he should probably include a bit more oxygen in the mix a few times. Some of the other attempts, at these kind of volatile gases that he made, he talks about how he's taken like 3 breaths, and he says he could feel himself sinking into annihilation. It takes the bag away from his mouth, and the immediate oxidation in his mouth burns the hell out of his teeth, gums and throat, and absolute hooligan. Speaking of, he describes a later experience which shows how varied it was, that towards the last inspirations, the thrilling, which is what he calls the feeling in his fingers and extremities, the thrilling increased and the sense of muscular power became greater, and at last an irrepressible propensity to action was indulged in. I recollect but indistinctly what followed. I know that my motions were various and violent. So he was a huge fan of nitrous oxide, and I think in looking at what its effects are like, he's described some of them there, but very much it seems to be quite similar to ketamine, moderate dose ketamine. So we've done some studies where we've given people nitrous oxide, which is a 50% mix, like you'd get on a maternity ward, and get people to breathe it for like half an hour. And the kind of dissociation levels and the perceptual distortions are very much of a similar profile to ketamine. Not higher dose, but sort of more moderate dose. And there seem to be some interesting kind of interactions with people's personality traits. So how much people like it or want more of the drug seems to be predicted by depression. So people actually who are more have like higher depressive symptoms actually seem to like it, want more of the drug less. And people who have higher impulsivity seem to like it more. But what's interesting is that unlike ketamine and psychedelics, this is nitrous oxide in orange here, we've seen absolutely no increase in people's interest in it. And I don't really know why. Maybe it's because it's so old and it's kind of, so widespread that people kind of habituated to the potential value of it. But it's very much, in terms of being able to work with it and do research and give it to people without them needing to be sort of medically monitored the whole time or give them intravenous drugs, it's a lot easier to work with because it's just a gas that you're breathing in. But still, the things that we hear and see about nitrous oxide currently, like from our old mate Oscar Rickett here, he says that nitrous oxide perfectly represents today's uncommitted generation. He sounds like a charmer. But these are the images we see of nitrous oxide, right? And in fact, there was about a month ago, the Tory government were looking to increase sort of regulation on it, which is unusual because everything else they've done has been so measured and random. Like ketamine, nitrous oxide does seem to have some antidepressant properties. This is a study by Pete and Nagelli's group in, I'm not sure where they're based actually. But yeah, so you see a very similar rapid antidepressant effect for people who have treatment-resistant depression after inhaling nitrous oxide. And again, we see quite high response and remission rates from people breathing nitrous oxide. And this 50% N2O is the same as what you would get if you were in labour. So it's not anything different. It's not a special preparation or anything. I realise now this is a terrible slide. There's only one thing you need to know. That's here, the nitrous oxide line here. So these are the results of a study looking at complex birth. So people who had complications during their birth, which might have involved a lot of pain or emergency surgery. And in those scenarios, people will get nitrous oxide as a painkiller, and some people will get morphine as a painkiller, and some people will get both, depending on how severe the pain is. There was a prospective study, so finding a large cohort of women who'd gone through these complex births, and then looking at their PTSD symptoms subsequently. And what they found is that those who had received nitrous oxide had a lower incidences of PTSD following their complex births. There was a limit on that, obviously. People who were in 10 out of 10 pain felt very out of control. It only had a limit of a protective effect. But I think that is interesting and sort of leads us to ask what might be going on there. And one of the kind of things that is gaining traction or is a bit of a buzzword, I guess, currently in the neuroscience space is these drugs' effect on neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity, if you are unfamiliar, is generally the brain's sort of ability to change its microstructure and function to adapt. It's what makes us and allows us to be different tomorrow than we are today. And a key form of that is learning and memory, right? Everything that we learn is at some level implemented in the neurons in our brain. And there's this idea that these drugs, so ketamine, the psychedelics, and potentially nitrous oxide, increase this capacity for neuroplasticity. So how much your brain can adapt and change. Now, but a lot of this is based on kind of rat research, looking in petri dishes at what neurons do when you flood them in a solution of psychedelics. But we can't do that in humans, obviously. So we can think about plasticity at many levels that might be observable. So we can think of behavioral change as a kind of expression of plasticity. We can think of changing cognitive styles as an expression of plasticity. And we can also look at things like brain imaging and look at brain networks, beyond just looking at the kind of cell or subcellular level. However, I think all of these things are ultimately related. So whichever way we choose to think about neuroplasticity, they can be regulated both top down and bottom up. So your behavior can change synaptic plasticity, and changes in your synapses can produce changes in behavior. And so one way that people think or have suggested that ketamine might work is that in stressed brains, you see a reduction in synapses on neurons. So these are, sorry, I'm pointing at the wrong thing. On the left here, you can see these are dendrites on a neuron. In a mouse stress model, you can see this kind of reduction in the density here. So there's actual loss of dendrites, these little branches. And if you zoom in on those, these little knobs you can see on these dendrites are synapses. In a normal animal, they're quite thick. And then in the mouse that's undergone this stress induction procedure, you see this reduction. And so this led people to say that, this reduction in synaptic density and dendritic density is what produces some of the symptoms we see when we see, in depression. And might be why people don't just get better, because they're losing some of that capacity to adapt. So giving a single dose of ketamine will take the stressed out synapse from this, depleted level back to a normal density. It kind of rescues that lost plasticity. So it might be that by restoring that lost plasticity or ability to adapt, that might be how ketamine, seems to have these effects across different disorders. Neuroplasticity might be implicated. Psychedelics do the same thing. So again, this is more sort of petri dish research, but they gave their mouse neurons different psychedelics, so DOI, DMT, or LSD. And again, so here's a VEH is vehicle here, so placebo. Compared to DMT, you can see much lower increase in the synaptic density, and after DMT, a lot more. So again, a shared mechanism between ketamine and the other psychedelics that might explain why they seem to have these beneficial effects across a lot of disorders. And this has led to these drugs being termed psychoplastogens. Psychoplastogens that we can think of both, in this type of research on the micro scale as increasing synaptic density, but also on the macro level, looking at brain imaging studies, we can see large differences in spontaneous functional networks in brain activity patterns, and also changes in people's cognitive styles after taking psychedelic drugs and ketamine. So potentially increases in cognitive flexibility and certainly changes in mood and behaviors. So if you ask people how the drugs work, you could get any one of these answers. And the truth is, it's probably a little bit of all of these things. And we don't know what the actual answer is yet. And so we actually need a lot more research to figure out why these drugs might be useful. And one of the things that I focus on in that regard is maladaptive memory. So the idea here is that a lot of mental health disorders arise because of learning. So if you think about things like substance use disorders, no one's born addicted. It's something that happens during someone's lifetime and therefore requires some level of learning or behavioral adaptation to happen in the first place. And And in that scenario, things like, the way we learn about rewards in evolutionary terms is a useful capacity to have, to be motivated to seek rewards. It's what, keeps animals alive. But when we're out of our sort of evolutionary milieu in the modern day, it's like food environment, and we're constantly bombarded with adverts, things, and reminders of highly palatable food, for instance, that's everywhere. That capacity to be motivated to seek rewards can become harmful, and that's where this idea of maladaptive learning comes from. So to the extent that this learning sort of produces negative health outcomes or psychological outcomes, it can be considered maladaptive. And so an example here, let's think about excessive drinking or drug use. So the idea is that these are behaviours that are acquired through, initially people experimenting with alcohol. If you give booze to a baby, or you show a baby a picture of this beer, they won't really have much of a response. Some of us might be looking at that and thinking that looks quite tasty. And eventually, through those repeated pairings of the taste of beer with the pleasurable feelings you get and the rewarding effects of the beer itself, you form this association. It means when you see a beer in the future, you might experience craving and want to go and get a pint. This baby is my baby, by the way. I didn't steal a baby. I actually, I put this picture at a conference shortly after he was born, and tried to make a joke about it, and it was just like deathly silent. What are you doing to your child? He's fine. Yeah, and he's like, only like half a bottle a day at the moment. It's fine. Learning about the rewards basically encodes behaviours that allow us to get those rewards again. The counterexample to that is PTSD, where we have very negative experiences that lay down extremely unpleasant memories for people. And those memories can be re-triggered by reminders in the environment, and cause the symptoms of kind of re-experiencing the kind of typical of post-traumatic stress disorder. So maladaptive memory itself, I think, is an important target in mental health generally, but particularly acquired disorders. And so my research is focused on how we can interfere with memories. And you kind of have a bit of a life cycle of memories where you learn them or acquire them, and they have to go through this process of stabilization, which is called consolidation. And then they're kind of in long-term storage, sort of waiting there to be retrieved. And when they're retrieved, they sort of tell you, what to expect next, or how to respond. And normally retrieval can either be internal, like we can choose to retrieve something, or it can be triggered off by something in the environment. And generally, I'm focusing on the latter, the kind of triggering of retrieval of memories. So like current therapies try to stop maladaptive memories from producing the behaviors that we see in certain disorders by extinction learning, which is like exposure therapy. So people will be, rehearse their trauma over and over again in a therapy session until it stops producing these feelings of fear or panic. The problem with that is that that's not unlearning. You're not unlearning the original memory. You're suppressing it essentially, which means that the original memories are actually still there. And so when that suppression stops being effective, you get resurfacing of symptoms, which might be why we see such high long-term relapse rates after these types of treatments. So what my research has looked at is trying to either prevent this process of consolidation in the first place, or otherwise see if we can directly target memories. Because if we can prevent the consolidation, then we can break this chain, and then memories that aren't consolidated can't be retrieved, and we kind of prevent this cycle of relapse. So coming back around to ketamine and nitrous oxide now, both of those drugs and other anesthetic drugs also have a strong amnestic effect, so they make people forget things. Which is why if you wake up during a surgery, you probably won't remember, it's fine. And one of the reasons they do that is they block this receptor called NMDA, which is key in forming these memories. It looks like this. So what ketamine and nitrous oxide do is block the channel, which means they can't fire. And yeah, and you get this sort of inability to form new memories. So it's difficult to study trauma in an experimental setting because you can't ethically traumatize people, obviously. So we have this thing called a trauma film paradigm where you basically show people a horrible film that kind of really sticks with you. And then you can test sort of what if, you know, drugs you give people shortly afterwards, you know, do they affect how many sort of intrusive thoughts people have about the film over the next week? So if you're interested or know the film, it's a clip from the film Irreversible by Gaspar Noé. Yeah, someone knows it. It's extremely unpleasant. And what you see is, yeah, people have these unbidden thoughts about the scenes from the film. So these intrusions, basically how many times they think about it in a negative way per day. So what we did was give people nitrous oxide or match just like air after watching this film for 30 minutes. And then as you would expect with it, like preventing the stabilization of these memories, you see a much swifter drop off. So by the second day, and people are having fewer intrusions about the film compared to the people who had air. Which might be why, you know, I showed you that study about the complex birth. The women who had nitrous oxide, perhaps it was preventing the consolidation of those traumatic memories. The problem with that is, as you might anticipate, it's very difficult to get to people in the immediate hours after their trauma, which is when consolidation happens. But sort of research over the last 30 years, I guess, has shown that rather than just weakening consolidation to target and rewrite or weaken memories, there's another process that can be triggered when you retrieve a memory called reconsolidation, slightly unoriginally. And if you interfere with that process, you can take an already established memory, a long-term memory, reactivate it, which makes it unstable, and stop it restabilizing. And I mean, people throw around the term erase. I don't know, it might be a bit strong and a bit sci-fi for me, but certainly weaken or you know, fundamentally reduce the behaviors that are associated with a memory. So most of my research now looks at trying to target this with drugs. So the idea here would be that, say you've got someone who wants to reduce their drinking, and they find that they are struggling to do so. We can show them reminder cues of their drinking memories to try and reactivate those memories, make them unstable, and interfere with their restabilization with the drug. So hopefully we can stop those memories persisting. And yeah, I'm not going to say erase again, although I just did. So ketamine and nitrous oxide, being that we know that they produce amnesia, could be good drugs for doing this with. So the question is, if we reactivate people's memories and give people either ketamine or nitrous oxide, can we reduce their drinking memories and then reduce their drinking? There's a couple of caveats here. Your memories aren't always becoming unstable. It's actually quite difficult to get them to destabilize, because you can imagine if they were just becoming unstable all the time, then interference could happen and you forget far more than you should. So there are a couple of key things that you need to get a memory to destabilize. And that's like a brief retrieval, brief reminders, and something called a prediction error, which you can think about as kind of surprise regarding the outcome that was expected. So in the case of drink, if you smell a beer or you see a beer and you expect to drink it, the prediction error would maybe be not getting that beer. And the studies that I'm going to talk about quickly were in hazardous drinkers. So these aren't people with a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, I can see this study, but people who drink over the recommended daily allowance, over 30 or 40 units a week, which is quite a lot, like a harmful amount of alcohol, but not actively seeking treatment. And this describes a large proportion of the UK population. And so this is kind of how we try and retrieve the memories. Basically, we get people in who want to reduce their drinking, put a glass of beer in front of them, and tell them that they'll drink it after rating some like cue type images of alcohol. And then they see this set of screens that tells them to pick up the drink and get ready to drink it and then drink it. So that's supposed to recapitulate like what a normal drinking episode would be, right? You go to the pub, you're surrounded by cues, you have a beer in front of you, you drink. To try and get this surprise or prediction error, all we do is change that last instruction so that when they're expecting to drink the beer, it says stop, don't drink. People, sometimes don't like that. And then you take the drink away. So very much not what would happen in a typical drinking environment. Unless you're drinking with the wrong people. And to control for that, we get people to do exactly the same thing, but just with orange juice. So this should not, reactivate their alcohol memories. So I wanted to see if we could use that sort of reactivation of the memories to, pair with nitrous oxide. This was instructive in kind of meta science for me. Basically what we did is get some baseline measures, try and retrieve people's memories under nitrous oxide with this surprise. So, them not getting the drink, that's their prediction error here at the top, or the ones, some people did get to drink the drink, so they shouldn't have been surprised. Or some people got the orange juice reactivation, and we wanted to see, giving everyone nitrous oxide afterwards, would we see any differences in how much people subsequently drank? At least that was the aim. So as a kind of manipulation check, we asked people after they've gone through one of these procedures how surprised they were. Turns out when you get people into the lab who drink a lot, and tell them that they're going to be able to drink a beer, they don't believe you. Because they know you're a psychologist, they expect foul play. So looking at these surprise ratings, a lot of the people who are supposed to receive this prediction error surprise were just absolutely not surprised that they were. So there was, to save this paper, there was like a little post hoc regrouping basically by who actually experienced the surprise as we expected and who kind of expected to not be able to drink. And when we looked at it that way, we did see that the nitrous oxide afterwards seems to produce a reduction in the subsequent drinking and a significant reduction in people's craving in response to alcohol cues. But that's, with the caveat that this was a very exploratory analysis. So that's something we're following up currently, hopefully having learned our lessons about people not believing us. So to kind of follow this up, we wanted to look at ketamine, because it's, if nitrous oxide is amnestic, ketamine is even more amnestic, so we wanted to have the best sort of chance at proving the principle that we could interfere with these memories. Basically exactly the same study, so in hazardous drinkers, but this time we kind of had learned a bit of a lesson, which means that on the first day, everyone comes in and gets to drink a beer, so that the next time they're going through that, I think we're just doing the same thing. And then, so we either got two groups, had those memories retrieved on the second day and got either ketamine or placebo for half an hour intravenous. And then another group got ketamine without any prior reactivation of their drinking memories. And then we assessed follow-up drinking levels, craving, etc., up to 9 months. And this is what we saw. So RET plus ket is retrieval plus ketamine. This is the number of drinking days after the intervention. saw a decent drop off in the ketamine group, but not the other two control groups, which equated a 23.5 mean weekly reduction of units, which is quite a lot. These people were actually drinking, a lot, despite not seeking treatment for alcohol. They were drinking, 70 units a week on average. So really quite heavy drinkers actually, but we saw a pretty hefty reduction in the ketamine combined with the retrieval group. And then over the long term, we saw the biggest reduction in that group too. And you'll notice here that that group did start out drinking a little bit more than the other two control groups. So that by the end of the follow-up period, they'd actually reached roughly the same level, but the overall reduction in the ketamine and retrieval group was much larger. And so it's unclear as to what extent things like regression to the mean contributed to that. So this kind of approach of reactivating and interfering with unhelpful memories could be extended to lots of different types of treatments and lots of different types of drugs. It doesn't have to be something like ketamine or nitrous oxide that is amnestic. And it has been suggested as one of the mechanisms by which psychedelic drugs work. There's not much direct evidence for that yet. And I'm unsure as to how likely it is to be at play in the studies that we've seen with psychedelics so far, given that it's quite difficult to get memory really unstable. But we want to test that, and we thought DMT would be the perfect drug to do that with, because it's very rapid acting and quite amnestic. I piloted the dose that we'll be using in the study on Tuesday. I can confirm I can remember fairly little of what I'm sure happened. But it's it's really quick, so 20 minutes beginning to end. It's a 10-minute infusion we're doing of 27.5 milligrams. And the idea being that if we can reactivate these memories and fundamentally disrupt cognitive processing and connectivity between brain regions that are normally required to restabilize those memories with DMT, then we should see similar effects to what we did with ketamine. We're brain scanning people, watching movies a week before and a week after to see if we can see any changes following DMT. And there's kind of two arms. One's just in healthy volunteers and one's in hazardous drinkers, like the ketamine study. And in that group, we'll be collecting EEG instead. And that's because we can't do the reactivation bit in the scanner, because it's, no one wants to drink in an MRI scanner. So yeah, but aiming to directly test this mechanism, it'll be the biggest study of DMT ever done. And we're basically taking a bit of a shotgun approach, looking at brain imaging, mood and cognitive measures, behavioral changes up to 9 months, and experience sampling to look at changes in the quality of people's inner speech or spontaneous speech, and whether that, which one of these things best predicts people who change their behavior for the longest and the largest amount following DMT. This is kind of a schematic of the study, which is probably a terrible thing to go to now, but I'm happy to maybe, if people are interested with questions, to talk through it, as I'm aware that I've spoken for far too long already. Yeah, just one thing, I don't know, you saw from the publication slide that psychedelics are big right now, but I think hopefully I've given you a flavour of just how little we know about the mechanism, and it's I'm a little bit worried about there being a bubble that's going to burst if people rush to clinical trials and to monetize these drugs too quickly. So I'd hope to see more mechanism first studies in the future. But that is all from me. Sorry for speaking for so long. Yeah, thank you.
That's brilliant. I just get the screen sharing, so there might be some questions online. Do you want to take some questions from the room first, and I'll just get your.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I saw the time and panicked. Yeah.
I just showing that. What did it then he marks its birthday? Happy birthday, Mark. Birthday question.
I have two questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, it's your birthday.
Just first questions on like the subjective effects of, like, say the differences that I've experienced between nitrous oxide and ketamine, and with regards to memory. And the second question is a technical question on ketamine and its comparisons to alcohol. So firstly, the main thing I've noticed is the difference I've always said between nitrous oxide and ketamine. Although often ketamine can feel like an elongated nitrous oxide experience to some extent, is that nitrous oxide has that amnesia, whereas ketamine, well, in my experience, can actually, and that may be because of the neuroplasticity, but it tends to improve my memory retention and formation, both during the experience and in the after time. Yeah, I guess the question is, where have you learned about the amnesia side of ketamine? Because I totally get that with nitrous oxide, but I haven't really experienced that. It's all with ketamine.
Right, yeah.
The second question was slightly different.
Okay, shall I go that first? So you get to an interesting point with the ketamine, which is the massive variability that we see in people's responses to it. Some people love it and seem to be fairly functional on it, and other people are just completely out. And it's almost 50-50 and impossible to predict. And I would assume that the greater amnestic effects you would see in the people who are more dissociated on ketamine. I mean, in terms of the amnestic effect, some Celia's older studies have shown that people have worse recall after ketamine on like verbal recall tasks. Okay. With the nitrous, so there's actually very little specifically on nitrous oxide. There's some stuff from the 60s, but then it kind of fell out of fashion and people just haven't been doing much research on it. So in terms of like the evidence base for which is more or less amnestic. Sure. Yeah.
So I mean, my experience is entirely subjective, but and it's always been in kind of polydrug contexts. Right. But in those contexts, in a party, I will not be able to recall in any way the universe-wide conspiracy trick that has come from a nitrous oxide experience. Yeah. But with ketamine, I don't know if it's because of the strengthening of myelin sheaths or something like that, but there is just a way in which recall, maybe not like specifically measured verbal recall, but general memory of what's happened has been clearer, almost clearer than it would have been without it. So that was like,
how are you taking the nitrous oxide?
Yeah, well, that's a good, it could be oxygen depletion as well, of course. Thank you. I'll look at that study. So the other question is ketamine a glutamate reuptake inhibitor?
It's an antagonist at the NMDA receptor, so it doesn't inhibit reuptake.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether one of the reasons for people not drinking so much after ketamine could be because the perceived deficits in their like endocrines that might be one of the reasons that they drink are less at play after a ketamine experience, such that the urge to drink is less because of that like biochemical change in glutamate.
So you do see increases in extrasynaptic glutamate after ketamine.
Okay.
On over a longer time scale,
which
might be specifically because of its effects on GABAergic interneurons.
Whereas there's less after alcohol, right? Yeah. Right. So I was wondering whether that could be one explanation, as well as the memory thing, which I think is
absolutely, yeah, for sure. Okay. I don't know. You probably know better than me, Celia, if there's much research.
There's like MRI studies, but I don't know. In alcohol, that's more in depression, a little bit of like with spectroscopy and glutamate, but you can't really mix specifically. You have to go to glutamine, which is right. It increases over time, but nobody's really correlated it to drinking, so that would be a cool thing.
Next study.
Do that.
Membrane alcohols and NMDA receptor antagonists as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
yeah, at higher doses. I mean, that's why people say that ketamine is alcohol-like.
Signal, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
In alcohol, so when you like spin out, that's the.
No, I mean, on,
type
yeah,
effects
I can
of
definitely
alcohol, yeah.
Yeah, I can see on a subjective level, like the urge to drink and the urge to take ketamine are kind of similar, but you feel like more refreshed after ketamine than after drinking. So, but in a way that you don't really feel like you need to drink. That makes sense. Like, yeah. Yeah. So, thank you.
Oh, happy birthday, by the way. Should we go here and then in the back?
Thanks. Can I ask a non-scientific question, which is that I was surprised when you said that you were going to visit problematic memories with psychedelics, that you're aiming to erase them as opposed to put the memories in a different sort of cosmic context or something like that. I mean, is that something that's kind of difficult to measure scientifically, or is that?
Yeah, so you actually get to a good point, which is like, is it that they get altered or weakened, and they're potentially two very different things. So we can't. We have very limited control over what actually happens to the memories, and it might just be that there's a theory that they kind of get filed away in this context when you have a drug like that, which makes them less harmful. But I don't know if I'd ever say that we were erasing the memories, but I think in terms of what we know from the memory processing perspective, you need communication between sort of prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and other brain areas that are involved in memory to restabilize them. And we see like disruption of that connectivity with psychedelics. It might also be, though, at a very much more cognitive level, people are reprocessing the memories differently to make it. But there's very little way for us to get at that. Basically. Maybe we can ask them afterwards, I suppose. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so
yeah, just a follow on from that. With things like sort of bioacoustic feedback and EDMR, is that a similar sort of method where you're trying to sort of remap something that was a bad memory onto better things?
Oh man, EMDR.
I think bioacoustic feedback.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting a study to see whether there's a reconsolidation mechanism for EMDR therapy, and it's suggested by practitioners. I don't know as much about bioacoustic feedback, I'm afraid, but reconsolidation is one of those things that people throw out as a mechanism for everything, a bit like neuroplasticity, without actually having much evidence for it. And so, yeah, it could be, but I would say wait until it's shown to be the case rather than, yeah. That's a great question, though.
So I briefly skim read quite a lot of the debate that you showed recently in Parliament, and two things kind of jumped out at me. One, the UK Minister for Drugs didn't attend, and instead it was the UK Minister for Immigration that was basically briefed on the party lines, and when asked why the Drugs Minister didn't attend, it was, I don't know, it was departmental business. So it kind of gives you some indication of our government's perspective on this and how serious they take it. While at the same time, what the Minister for Immigration did say was the mechanism for sort of rescheduling that they saw was if a pharmaceutical company applies for a license to use one of these drugs, this was specific on psilocybin, for basically for-profit medicine in that case. So when we're looking at research, and you as a researcher personally, what do you view your role and responsibility in trying to push through a more sensible method of rescheduling in light of the fact that the government just doesn't give a shit?
It's a tough one. One of our master students now was involved in lobbying the Tories to get the debate in Parliament, and we gave statements that he could use, and I think it's important. Yeah, for me, it's important to change legislation on this stuff, but our current government is so intransigent, or unmotivated.
And while we're doing that, sorry, just to carry on, how do you make sure that this research that could be so potentially beneficial to so many people isn't then co-opted by pharmaceutical companies to just have a for-profit medical model? And for example, we see like cannabis now in the UK can be privately prescribed, but won't be prescribed on the NHS. While cannabis is a lot cheaper to do, I can see these kind of medicines not being cheap with, guided therapy for them rather than just you can smoke it. How do you make sure that this research doesn't just become something that's for extremely wealthy individuals and is actually something accessible in the NHS for people that need it?
I can't make sure of that, unfortunately. I publish, the findings openly and share the methods as much as possible, and then I guess if whatever is used for those, I'm not interested in chasing intellectual property or anything. But people will use research and push through research, and frankly, it's probably most likely that the treatments we will see will be offered by pharma companies or private clinics. But yeah, that is capitalism, I suppose, and as much as I don't like it, it's beyond much. It's a bit of a hand wavy answer, but it's quite sad.
I'm just waiting for someone to give me the answer.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of has that well with that.
Yeah, I would love someone to give me the answer.
Do we just keep exiting?
Yeah, would it be better if researchers actually do patent?
Yeah.
That's a good
Which
question.
is flies in the face of so much open science, but in this specific use might actually help. But then that
It's Jane, I'd love to talk about it, you mentioned about that, I put evidence you will go to look at it and then decide on to say that you'll never enforce that.
Yeah, he talks to like one of the UCL's patent managers, business managers, about our memory reactivation thing, and he basically laughed at us. He's like, "What? So you just published how you do it openly?" Like, yep. Well, you've got nothing to patent. So yeah, maybe it's too late for us. It's a good patenting, benevolent patenting. I've not heard of it before. It's interesting.
Yeah. And the new study you mentioned, the protocol ketamine, what's your take on it? Because it's obviously a hot topic at the moment, everyone's waiting for the peer review.
Yeah.
Is propofol a powerful antidepressant, or is ketamine, what's the crack?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, why couldn't propofol be an antidepressant?
That's what we understand.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we knew.
Right.
But I don't think that's the take. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say that it's just proof that the experience is necessary. She's not a highly scientific take on it. The experience doesn't really have an outside. Usually, that I get feeling that
I'm a bit stumped. Yeah. Personally, I mean, I would say maybe wait for a replication. I don't know how soon that's going to be though, but yeah, could be one of those just weird anomalous findings that no one can explain, or it could be actually onto
I
something.
guess the follow-up needs to do it with other
Yes. Yeah.
You think having conscious group because you couldn't see the way that you did the events.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Everyone's unconscious. Yeah.
Unless we can get someone to stay awake during propofol. Yes.
So just a clarification question. So the memory consolidation hypothesis as explaining how psychedelics work is not contradictory to neuroplasticity. It's just explaining at a different layer what's happening.
Yeah, I would say so. Because the reconsolidation is itself a type of plasticity, I suppose. They're not contradictory. It's not. Yeah, it's not one or the other. Sorry, I'm sorry if I gave that impression.
Yeah, it's just it's like a requirement that things become plastic before they're reconsolidated.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of the memories, it's only when they undergo this process of destabilization. So protein synthesis gets prevented, and synaptic proteins get degraded, and they need to be restabilized. So none of the interfering matters unless you get that destabilization first. Peter's got one. Yeah, Peter, sorry.
So there was a slide where you said the phenomenology is probably an effective factor in ketamine use. And at the same time, as was just spoken about, neuroplasticity seems to be a factor as well. So I wondered if you could speak about the possible, I mean, if we don't have an exact answer for this, but possible relationship between neuroplasticity and the actual experience phenomenology that might play a therapeutic role?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, I don't know specifically. You might, I mean, in terms of, so are you talking about ketamine or just psychedelics generally, or?
Well, you can generalize that version.
Yeah, yeah, I think the experience that it, you know, to an extent, it's a truism that the experience is at some form of neuroplasticity itself. Right? You wouldn't have a change in perception unless there was a change in your sort of homeostatic signaling in your brain. But in terms of how the two are related, I don't know. I get my hot take is that people who have the worst experiences in our upcoming DMT study will be the people who have the best effects in terms of behavioral. You know, people who just have a great time on the DMT maybe aren't getting as much of the therapeutic action of it. Maybe people actually need to go through the challenging experiences to have more of a therapeutic benefit. But that's a total wayward hypothesis at the moment and not proved yet.
I mean, just to link it with philosophy a bit more. In philosophy, there's this problem called mental causation. You know, that we think that, well, many people believe that, you know, we have evolved mentality because it is effective in some way. You know, we are not walking robots or zombies. At the same time, believe that these experiences are determined by, as you say, underlying physiological structures. But that seems to be incompatible. You know, bottom up or a top-down approach. And it's a big problem in philosophy generally, and it's interesting how studies like this kind of, you know, do begin to touch upon that problem. Which ultimately from mental causation, has phenomenology itself actually have an effective role?
Yeah, well, I guess bringing it into a sphere that I would be comfortable actually talking about, the models would say that it's bidirectional. So you have higher level control over lower level processes by when you have neurons organized into networks, they exert a certain level of control over their.
But that would still be at the top level, still physiological, right? So rather than phenomenological.
Yeah.
Although
So
they're correlated, of course. But the question is, what's the nature of correlation?
I do not know. Yeah, should we go here and on the back? Yeah, sorry.
I'm not entirely sure how memories actually work, but my understanding is that memories are associated with a million different things, basically. So my general question is basically, how precise can you be when you're trying to target specific memories? Because like you try to tap into addiction, but like it goes all the way to that, basically. So basically, how do you dislodge, in this case, on addiction without like dislodging family relationships or something?
Yeah, no, it's a good question about sort of what other memories come along for the rise, right? I guess it's quite a reductionist approach, I'll admit that, and we're looking particularly at these fairly basic associations between, you know, smells of beer and wanting to drink, that kind of thing. The more explicit, like verbally represented memories are less easy to disrupt. And also, I mean, there is work showing that you only get quite specific disruption of memories that you reactivate, but without testing, you know, holistically across people's memories before and after, we can never actually know what else has been affected, because then, we only see what we look at. So I guess there is potential for other things to be targeted, but I don't know, we've not had any sort of, well, as far as I know, there's not evidence to show that does happen.
If you don't mind me following up, with something like alcohol addiction, with smell, etc., you targeting something with many different sensory kind of associations with something specific. As you said, probably more verbal stuff is kind of harder to kind of activate and reactivate. Do you think it's kind of possible to go down that route in, like, say, 10 years down the line with more research, or do you think like there are some fundamental issues with how we understand memories that's going to make this very tricky?
I think it would be possible. I mean, if you talk to a lot of psychotherapists, they'd say that that's what they were attempting to do with things like reappraisal and people go through therapy. It's just that it's very difficult. So it's very difficult to assess whether reconsolidation is actually the mechanism underlying anything without having this quite reductionist, experimentally controlled paradigm to look at it. And yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the only things that are currently tractable are these kind of associative memories, but down the line, yeah, maybe it'll be possible. We just need a lot more research on how to actually best get those memories to become unstable, which is what we can't currently tell.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Mine is a very mundane question
Perfect.
about the mice. And how you know they're stressed and depressed and how you measure that. Sorry, when I saw that, and that you can see inside their brains, how you do that and how you know they're stressed.
So the mouse stress model is a very unpleasant thing that they do to mice, where they basically isolate them in their cages, or they put them in their cages with like a more aggressive partner, restrict their food. Sometimes they restrain them. Yeah, not nice stuff. The mice start showing behaviors that mice do when they're afraid. Basically, they move less, they freeze more. I think they shake. So yeah, it's a behavioural thing that they model for the mice, and then they look in the brains and see what that does to the synaptic density. So yeah, so they stress them out and kill them basically.
All right.
Yeah, pretty grim.
Yes. Just a quick follow-up. So how do you measure the effect of the reversible? I remember when you mentioned that movie, that's a hardcore one. Does that have an effect on the people that look at the movie? Can you measure it in the same way?
As in people who've seen the film already?
Yes.
Yeah, we do ask. So you haven't seen this film, have you? And then they can't take part if they have.
All right.
But I mean, one thing we didn't control for though is gender, or because if you know the scene, it's probably more likely to be affecting if you're a woman.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's something we are doing now. We're still doing studies with it. Irreversible is really getting a lot of airings in our lab. Yeah.
I think that there's a very basic association addiction where it's cortical locate. Do you also believe that's the connection, because addiction is also known that there's less connectivity between the frontal area and the cortical areas, that it's like a parallel process is what's happening, or do you think it's related to it?
Quite possibly related, yeah. I think maybe it comes back to that kind of inhibitory suppression, voluntary suppression versus automatic response tendencies, like you say, more subcortically entrenched memories. I think that reduction in prefrontal control is probably why we see things like exposure therapy failing so much. They would just be in the chat, presumably.
Yeah, yes.
No, I mean, there's nothing in the chat.
There's no, there's not. That's final birthday question. And very exciting.
So you mentioned like with neuroplasticity, which yes, quite a key term in this, just so I can understand it better. You mentioned that you had that pyramid, so behavior, cognition, network, cells, synapse, and slightly following on from Irini's question, is it that and Peter's, I guess, when I say that, again, sorry, subjective experience, because I'm not a psychologist and theologian and philosopher, but when I really push myself for a week trying to get the new skill on the piano, my mental arithmetic will go up. So that would be an example of like the behavioral level, but presumably it's affecting the synaptic level as well in terms of neuroplasticity, perhaps.
Yeah.
But then when I microdose magic mushrooms, that mental arithmetic will also go up, and that would be an example of the synaptic level working more into behavior.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you read the book Flowers for Algernon?
No. Should I?
It's mad. I think any psychologist should. It's about the premise is they managed to figure out a way through drugs and surgery to increase someone's IQ. Someone who's like IQ of 60, they managed to like quadruple his IQ, and the story goes through his relationship to his doctors and therapists and psychologists and everyone around him, and how it changes and it reaches this apex. I won't ruin it, but I think it's incredibly intricate tale about the relationship between psychology and subjectivity, I guess.
Flowers for Algernon.
Flowers for Algernon, yeah. There's a terrible film that you shouldn't watch.
Okay.
The book is incredible. Yeah.
All right. Brilliant. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Check it out. Yeah.
Well, anyone more questions? But we're going, I think we're at time anyway, so thanks for having.